Hello and welcome everyone to today's event, Scientists and Activists versus Fossil Fuel Finance. I'm Kathy Mulvey, Climate Accountability Campaign Director at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I'll be today's moderator. So today's webinar will focus on the summer of heat on Wall Street, a recent 13-week campaign of sustained civil disobedience protests targeting big banks for their role in fueling the climate crisis. According to this year's Banking on Climate Chaos report, the world's 60 biggest banks have committed close to $7 trillion to companies doing business in fossil fuels in the 8 years since the Paris Climate Agreement. Think about that. That's an eye-popping number. And this is at a time when we desperately need to be making a fast and fair transition away from fossil fuels in order to limit the worst impacts of climate change. These fossil fuel projects also cause significant local pollution and contamination and negative health impacts to communities near their operations. That's why over 100 organizations and thousands of people came together to target the big banks that finance the fossil fuel industry, including Citi, the largest financier of fossil fuel expansion since the Paris Agreement. In June, over 750 scientists wrote to Citi about the scientific urgency of the climate crisis, elevating the demands of the Summer of Heat campaign. Citi later responded to the letter, but did not sufficiently address the points raised by the scientists and never responded to a request for a follow-up conversation. And meanwhile, for months, Citi has been ignoring requests for a meeting from frontline leaders from the Gulf South, whose communities are being harmed by fossil fuel projects that Citi is funding. So our goal with today's event is to highlight and elevate the voices of Summer of Heat organizers, frontline community leaders, and scientists to call attention to the complicity of big banks with the climate crisis and environmental racism, and to share our demands for what these institutions need to do to get on a different path. Today, we'll hear from Jenny Sia, organizing manager at the Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition, Michael Johnson, a leader with the Flatbush chapter of New York Communities for Change, Roishetta Sibley Ozane, that's actually Ozane, founder and CEO of the Vessel Project of Louisiana, Dr. Sandra Steingraber, senior scientist at the Science and Environmental Health Network and co-founder of Concerned Health Professionals of New York, and Dr. Rose Z. Abramoff, scientist at Wintergreen Earth Science, board president of the Climate Emergency Fund, and activist with Scientist Rebellion. If you have questions during the presentation, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question there. We'll get to as many questions as possible by the end. So I'll start by turning it to Jenny and Michael to talk about the Summer of Heat on Wall Street campaign and why activists shut down the New York headquarters of Citi many times over the summer. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Kathy, and thanks to the Union of Concerned Scientists for putting this panel together. I'm just going to start by talking about sort of the overview of the Summer of Heat campaign, some of the highlights of the structures, and why we embarked on this. So I'm Jenny C. I use she, her pronouns. And, the climate movement and climate finance in particular has so much amazing work happening, but rarely does it feel like we get to come together in a really coordinated and sustained campaign way. And so the genesis of the Summer of Heat was to take a long sustained action across a wide coalition, including groups from not just the climate movement, but other movement spaces as well, to come together for a direct campaign against a specific target, the target being Citibank. The belief was that it couldn't be a one-off, it had to be sustained, and we needed to put real pressure through direct action tactics and to escalate. Citibank is the largest funder of fossil fuel expansion, making it a clear target and one of the climate criminals that's responsible for the rapid warming of our planet. So the demands of the campaign were to stop funding fossil fuels and this is of course for Citi, but Wall Street in general, to also exponentially increase the funding for renewable energy, to respect human rights and indigenous sovereignty as part of that just transition, and also to repair the harm. So it was important not only to address the funding that was going in to the fossil fuel industry and the climate crisis, but to also to compel Wall Street and Citibank to move their money to actually repair those harms and acknowledge the damage that has been done to vulnerable communities, to frontline communities, many of whom are working class people of color. And that also means, moving money away from funding fossil fuel expansion, which they can do immediately to phase that out. So I did want to just share a couple slides to go over very quickly some of the highlights of the campaign. So if you give me a moment to do that. So we had over 5,000 people join and take action together over these 13 weeks. We had 45 total actions and 700 arrests as part of this campaign. At Citibank in particular, there were actually 32 of those 45 actions, the vast majority of those including people who are taking civil disobedience. And that's actually one action almost basically every 2.7 days. We also had 4 disruptions of executives. We also took action against the insurance industry. We had 2 civil disobedience actions at Chubb and rallies at AIG, and also the home of the Chubb CEO. Private equity and asset managers are also part of this problem. So that included rallies at KKR and BlackRock, as well as at Vanguard headquarters, and 2 disruptions of executives from those companies. We had a lot of news headlines, which is amazing. And what this said was that we were able to break into the mainstream press, including in financial outlets like Bloomberg, or even just like mainstream press like the New York Times, The Hill, not necessarily explicitly progressive outlets, to really publicize Citibank as a climate criminal and to push against this narrative they continuously put out about being sustainable, about being a leader in this green transition, about putting all this money into net zero transition. There's also a lot of social media hits. People might have seen orcas running around, might have seen some hot dogs running around, might have seen a lot of this content in the social media space, which is indicative that this was resonating, right, with a broad swath of people, with young people, intergenerationally, across a lot of movement spaces in the digital place. Another thing to really highlight about the Summer of Heat is that the focus of the campaign through the thematic weeks was to represent the vast array of impacts that climate has, in many different spaces and places across age, across gender, across communities, across the world. So the key component that made the Summer of Heat such a successful start to what is a longer term movement is that we had elders, young people, migrant justice orgs working in solidarity with Palestinian organizations for the anti-war moment we're in. Such a wide and faith group, such a wide and vast collection of people coming together to show that climate is not only impacting everyone, but it also impacts people disparately. So I'm going to stop screen sharing here. So just to say, it's been an incredible 13 weeks. The major takeaways is that this is the start. We're in it for the long haul because Citibank has felt the pressure. We could see that day in and day out in the way employees were lined up by the thousands, almost daily, every single week, in the way that they are trying to, and the way, honestly, in their silence, because they know if that they caved in from the campaign, it would mean that the pressure worked and other banks would also have to cave in. So what this means is that we're at the start and that we are going to be continuing this movement, and the Summer of Heat is sort of a test of concept for this type of campaign, and we are really excited and hope that this is just the beginning of a longer struggle, because we know that we're not going to be able to stop climate change unless we really stop the fossil fuel industry and the capital that funds it. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kathy to take it to the next panelist.
Thanks so much, Jenny. So next, we're going to hear from Sandra about the role of scientists in the Summer of Heat campaign and why scientists are taking to the streets to engage in civil disobedience. Sandra, over to you.
Thank you, and I'll apologize in advance for the background noise. There's a kind of infrastructure project going on in my street right now. So I'm going to tell you what I how I answer this question in two ways, and I think it'll probably sound contradictory. It's what I tell fellow scientists when I talk to them about this issue, and then what I tell members of the public about scientists. And so here's my take on both of these, and then I'm going to try to bring it together at the end. What I tell my fellow scientists, and some of this, for example, I said at the podium at the AGU meetings, the Union for, I'm not going to remember the acronym. Rose, you're going to have to help me out. It's the the Earth Sciences big meeting, right?
American Geophysical Union?
That's it, American Geophysical Union. Last December, Rose and I both spoke on a panel sort of about this very theme. And my message is to put science, my fellow scientists sort of on notice, to say that, look, we collect this data and do science in an ethical context. Part of the nobility of being a scientist is that we're really trying to make the world better. I think all scientists kind of went into this field with that as a motivation. And that means that, and that is why the last step of the 7-part scientific process is to communicate your results, right? Which means not just dutifully publishing in the peer-reviewed literature, which is behind a paywall in an obscure place that you have to have a subscription to a research library to read, but it means speaking and communicating results beyond the 5 people in your field who are actually going to read your whole study and plus your funder. In other words, you have to kind of go tell it on the mountain and speak data to power and be an evangelist for your science, especially if your science is about the climate. Because surely the goal here is to turn science into science-informed policy. And it turns out that it's nobody's job to take your science out of the obscurity of the peer-reviewed literature into the halls of Congress, into the regulatory agencies, to, Janet Yellen in Treasury, who right now is working on trying to figure out what models Treasury should use in their climate, what assumptions they should use in their climate models while they figure out what the climate impact of hydrogen hubs is, right? So scientists need to be engaged with Treasury on this. Scientists need to be engaged with the IRS, who is now the regulatory agency for so-called carbon capture and storage hubs, which have this tax credit that come with it. So we have to be all up involved in these agencies. That's our job. It's nobody else's job but ours. And so in so doing, we can't confuse scientific objectivity with political neutrality. We are all very proud of our ability to just let data speak to us and take a look at the sample size and the confidence intervals and the range of parameters, confounding variables, and then come to some objective conclusion. But at the end of that, if we see signs of terrible atrocities unfolding, then it's our job not to remain politically neutral, but to ring alarm bells. And then the question, once you accept all of that, is what happens then when you do that, when you write the letters to the White House, when you testify before your state legislature, when you write letters, as I have, to Janet Yellen and to head of Treasury and Granholm in DOE, and they're just ignored. So where does our obligation as scientists end at that point? And I think here's where the Union of Concerned Scientists' own origin story really helps us, right? Because in 1969, a group of scientists at MIT came together because they were horrified that basic research and development was being directed to develop more horrible military technology at a time when the Vietnam War was at its peak and the Cuyahoga River in Ohio had just caught on fire, and demanded that scientific research and the funding for it be redirected to solving social and environmental problems. That's why I'm here, because I believe in that kind of stuff. So I have this very hardcore message to my fellow scientists that you just have to get out there, right? This is our job. On the other hand, I tell the public who ask me why more scientists aren't, donning white lab coats like Rose and I have and risk arrest, is I say, look, you can't expect us to do this. It's too much. to work as a full-time scientist in academia and actually generate and publish the data and do the things we need to do to build our career, and then also risk arrest and spend all of our time in the halls of Congress and waiting in line to give testimony before some public hearing. And a queer woman in the sciences, just trying to find my place in a very male-dominated, heteronormative community is a kind of a hostile act in and of itself. And so it's no accident that I'm no longer in academia, that Rose has actually lost her job, that one of our leading scientists, Peter Kalmus at NASA, is always being threatened with losing his job if he should be arrested one more time. This is very difficult. We scientists are doing this in a very difficult context. So when you see a few of us out there standing with you in the blockade line, know the self-discernment and the sort of sacrifice, because we have to figure out if we still want to generate data and do this work or not, because these things are actually in a practical way kind of at odds with each other. So clearly I have these two messages, one to my fellow scientists and then one to the public, and you can decide and tell me how you think they're contradictory or not. But to close this off here, the way I see Summer of Heat is as a kind of a laboratory, to use a scientific metaphor, as a laboratory to see what works, what messages really hit, how people feel inspired, and I know that I've been super inspired by specific actions, and other people resonate with other actions. And so there's a lot of lessons to be learned as we go forward. But I think sometimes the failure of us scientists to be effective actually is helpful in this weird way. Like, we all, through the leadership of Union of Concerned Scientists, sent this letter early on in the summer, right? We all signed it as scientists to Citibank, and we basically got ignored. And so that then showed everyone else that no one's listening to the science, including this financial institution that's the #1 financier of new fossil fuel projects in a time of climate crisis. And all these hundreds of scientists signed this very eloquent letter, and they just shrugged it off. So then that opens the space for people to have this sort of really search their own conscience and realize that science has been sidelined. This is what the science is saying. What is my responsibility as a human being in this moment? So sometimes when we scientists are ignored, it actually can serve, I think, as fuel. It shouldn't. Scientists should be listened to, but when we're not. I mean, if we were listening to science, we would have solved the climate crisis a long time ago, right? So the fact that we're not can sometimes be used to open a space for activism to move forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandra. And I think that was a great segue to hear from Rose about scientific consensus on climate and why we need to see much more ambitious action from all sectors of society and the economy. Rose, over to you.
Thanks, Kathy. And yeah, that's so inspiring, Sandra. I just want to echo everything that she said. There are risks for all of us to acting, but the risks are far greater if we do nothing. And the more that we do together, and that's part of the purpose of this webinar, the safer it is for all of us, right? Okay, so I want to start with a little context about where we are in the climate system. So 2023 was the hottest year on record by a lot, and 2024 may yet surpass it. We wouldn't be surprised if it did. For over 40 years, the scientific community has been sounding the alarm with an unprecedented level of consensus for us about the climate crisis, which is here. It's not a future problem. I used to have to reach back months or years for good examples of climate impacts, and now I can give you examples from the last few days. Unprecedented flooding in Central Europe, South Carolina bracing for floods from tropical storms, exacerbated by warm water, 113 days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Phoenix, Arizona. Could probably go on, but I won't. And this crisis is caused by the burning of fossil fuels. So 1% of the trillions in fossil fuel revenue currently goes to renewables. The rest goes to maintenance and expansion. But really, 0% of fossil fuel revenue should be going towards expansion. Citi has pledged to achieve net zero in their financing by 2050. But this pledge is actually, it sounds great, but it's actually wildly insufficient. When you consider that the entire world has to reach net zero by 2050 at the latest, and there is no viable net zero climate scenario that includes expansion of fossil fuel projects. Full stop. No negotiation with physics. So what we need to understand is that climate impacts will continue to get worse, even when emissions stop rising. Even when we cut emissions by 50%, by 75%, by 90%, impacts will continue to get worse until human-caused emissions reach zero. And even then, our ice will not return for millennia or longer. Biodiversity will take longer still, on the order of millions of years, and many systems will never recover. So that's the emergency that we're at. Cities' sustainability, blah, 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 is not borne out by the numbers. They fund low carbon projects at a much lower rate than fossil fuel activities. There is no evidence that they are, quote, supporting clients in high carbon in navigating the transition, which is something that they told us, because there are no major oil and gas companies that have business plans that would meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, not even close. Citi's own 2023 Environmental, Social, and Governance report shows little progress towards these goals. The words fossil fuel appear twice in this report, once in reference to the potential emission savings of investing in water purifiers, and once while boasting of switching to hydrogenated vegetable oil instead of diesel fuel for the generators at one data center. This is nowhere near the complete portfolio transition that we require. So to close, Citi may feel as if we're asking too much of them, but what we are asking for is the bare minimum required for the survival of human civilization. And we're now past the point of asking politely for our own survival and for the survival of our children. Yeah, thanks for inviting me here today. Thanks for the great panel.
Thank you, Rose. We have been having some technical difficulties, but we have Michael Johnson on the phone, and I'm hoping that we can hear him. And Michael Johnson is a member of New York Communities for Change. In 10 years of organizing with NYCC, he has won campaigns to combat climate change and ensure more affordable housing in New York City. He's originally from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which was recently devastated by Hurricane Beryl. Michael, can you speak up? You're muted. I hope we can unmute.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you to greetings to all. I hope you're hearing me loud and clear.
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. Greetings to one and all. Greetings to all my NYCC members and the panelists out there. Great contributions from the other previous presenters. Well, I must say that, again, when my name was mentioned, it is Michael Johnson, and I'm a member of the New York Communities for Change, NYCC, and I'm part of the Flatbush chapter for the past 10 years or so. This organization captures my attention due to its outreach programs, including a number of advocacy activities, fighting the plight of the poor, vulnerable, and the destitute, many of which were successful, especially in the areas of the rights of the affordable housing and issues of climate change. This I will continue, and we will continue to fight until justice is served. I'm from the Caribbean island, as was mentioned by the host, of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. which was recently devastated by Hurricane Beryl. Hurricane Beryl devastated my communities back home in St. Vincent and the Grenadines this summer. We saw churches, homes, community space destroyed, which brought tears to our eyes. My country is made up of the main St. Vincent Island and 32 smaller islands. The damage was especially horrible on the smaller islands. This destruction is happening because of fossil fuels and the bank like Citibank that fund the fossil fuel industry. Citi is the world's biggest funder of new fossil fuels since 2016. Every new fossil fuel project that Citi funds means turbocharging hurricanes and superstorms and bringing more and more devastation to my community and communities across the Caribbean. This has to stop. It must stop. That's why the Summer of Heat campaign targeted Citi as one of the worst banks most responsible for the climate crisis. It is not over until it is over. We have to call them out by name. The future of the next generation is in our hands. We must effect change. Our role today must bring the change that would impact the lives of the future generations in a positive way. Let us continue to fight against Hurricane Citibank and Hurricane Fossil Fuel. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. I'm so glad we were able to bring your voice into the room. We have been having a tricky time getting Rochetta connected. I know she's got a busy schedule with Climate Week. So Jenny, I'm wondering if you can share a bit about the recent report on fossil fuel finance in the Gulf South.
Yeah, absolutely. And this will be no substitute for Roy Shutta's, direct experiences and what's happening in the Gulf South. But I hope I can just maybe give some of the key findings in this report and why this report is so instrumental in highlighting Citi's role and what's happening with the LNG. So, Stand.Earth released this report that has some really incredible work done in it that highlights some of the ways that Citi's financing of LNG has direct health impacts in these communities, leading to increases in death and disease among some of the most vulnerable folks in the U.S., right, who are majority people of color, majority working class that live in these communities. And that's no mistake. Citi knows what they're doing. These companies, what they're doing, they go there on purpose. The report found a number of shocking figures. Cities, by providing at least $1.6 billion into the financing of 4 different LNG export terminals in Texas and Louisiana. By doing so, through the methodologies the report used, they were able to attribute as many as $36 million in health costs to premature deaths and 10 new childhood asthma cases per year, every year, because of this funding of the LNG export terminals. Citi has continued to commit a lot of money. They've committed like $2 billion in financing for Enbridge in 2023, just last year, which is a pipeline company that develops the Rio Bravo pipeline in Texas through the lands of the Carrizo-Comecrudo tribe. They've also financed $668 million to Formosa Plastics, which is now planning their so-called Sunshine Project in St. James, Louisiana, which could lead to annual impacts of as many as 12 premature deaths, $188 million in healthcare costs, and 3,000 lost work and school days. I'm just giving some of these general top figures, what the report found, because I think it really highlights the direct impact that Citi has through their funding of LNG and petrochemical companies. And it's more than clear that as part of the need to stop funding fossil fuel expansion, Citi absolutely needs to phase out their funding of fossil fuels in general, because these impacts are not abstract. They're directly linked, not just in the warming of our planet that leads to increases in natural disasters, but also in very real health impacts in frontline communities. So yeah, it's a really incredible report. Folks should read it. It gives so much context as to why in these specific datas and figures as to the real experience that folks in the Gulf South are facing. And the report really lies heavily also on the testimony of folks who've been fighting this fight like Rashida for a long time to tell Citi to get out of the Gulf South.
Thanks so much, Jenny, for jumping in there. And before we talk a bit about what everyone here can do, I just wanted to add a little bit more context. So an investigative report like this is so important to get information out into the public eye. And one of the things that we know is that the fossil fuel corporations themselves and financiers like Citi are not yet subject to mandatory and standardized corporate disclosures around their climate actions. And so, what that means is that the Securities and Exchange Commission earlier this year published a new rule that it applies to public companies, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is suing to block implementation of that rule, as well as a climate disclosure rule passed in California last year. And Citi is actually a member of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And so this kind of corporate opposition to meaningful climate legislation and regulation through lobbying is another really vital obstacle that we're facing here. And Alec Conan, who directs the Stop the Money pipeline, notes that Citi's CEO, Jane Fraser, is a vice chair of the Financial Services Forum and a board member of the Bank Policy Institute. And these are both, they receive negative rankings from LobbyMap for their lobbying on sustainable finance policy. So this is the political and policy context in which scientists and activists and frontline leaders are doing this work. And with that, now that we've heard the background, I did want to invite each of the speakers to share what everyone here on this call can do to take action, and then we'll move on to questions. So Jenny and Stop the Money Pipeline, what is next for the summer of heat?
Yeah. Well, the fight continues. I mean, we just had an action 2 days ago on Monday in front of Citi headquarters with Rashida and folks from the Gulf South to call out their continued inaction and refuse to meet with community members. So we as a campaign, as a coalition, are in our debrief phase. We want to take time to really think strategically about what next steps look like. So what we ask for folks to do is to stay tuned. You can go to the summerofheat.org website and sign up to stay in the loop so that the moment that we know what our next steps are, what next action steps are, you'll be able to hear from us. Additionally, there are other campaigns happening. Even if the Summer of Heat is, working on our next steps, there is a campaign around Vanguard, one of the largest asset managers that has a huge role in the fossil fuel industry. There's an ongoing campaign there, and you can visit the website vanguard-sos.com to sign up to take action and be involved. Summer of Heat, in support of that campaign, had an action outside of their headquarters in the Philadelphia suburbs this summer. So there's plenty of things happening, and we ask that folks stay tuned because we know that this is a long fight, and it's not just the summer.
All right, thanks so much, Jenny. And Sandra and Rose, what about for scientists?
Well, I'll use my couple minutes actually answering one of these good questions. This is from Mark Imlay, who says, what I have done as a scientist is not to actually lobby, but just to provide the scientific information to the staff of good legislators. So I just want to express my absolute gratitude to you, Mark, for doing that, which means you're doing more than 90% of my colleagues in bringing science forward and putting it in the public arena and normalizing the idea that science belongs in the political sphere and needs to inform decisions. Educating the staffers of our elected reps is kind of like lobbying without an ask, right? That's how I see it. I guess my message then goes out to my fellow scientists at this point, as an invitation to invite you to consider taking the next step, which is what Mark's describing. I call speaking data to power, which is what scientists do when we speak truth to power. We bring our data into the political world and talk about it, right? But there's another aspect can help build political power, which is we're not going to solve this until we do that. In other words, by gently making the case and sharing the data, if that were going to be sufficient, it would have solved the problem long ago. So the next step, I think, is to powerlessness, which means to take what we know into frontline communities and speak to the people whose lives are being harmed by fossil fuel infrastructure projects, pipelines, compressor stations, fracking sites, and so on. So when I spent a better part of 2.5 years when we were fighting fracking in New York, speaking about the data to our legislators, to our Department of Environmental Conservation and health departments, that was important. But actually, in retrospect, what I feel like was more important is that a whole group of us organized as the kind of scientists, informal scientists and residents to the anti-fracking movement. We were organized as concerned health professionals of New York. We took the data on the road and spoke every Friday night in somebody's church basement, Rotary Club, junior high school auditorium, town hall meeting about what we knew about fracking. And in so doing, we turned public opinion around. So suddenly the governor had a political problem. His political base was against fracking, and he could, to move forward in his political career, he could either be our champion and ban it, or he could, we kind of became a more powerful threat to him than the oil and gas industry, right? So, so he banned fracking on the grounds of science, but it didn't. Science alone wasn't enough to do that. It was science had to be brought into, like the people on the ground had to know the science, and then, as his constituents demand it. So that's what I saw, and then came the time when even that wasn't enough. Where I lived in Seneca Lake, we successfully banned fracking, but now we were going to import fracked gas and store it in old salt caverns under the lake. I did all the science on the hydrogeology to understand the risks and the harms to drinking water, the salinization of the water, the risk of catastrophic accidents for all the people, 100,000 of them depended on this lake for its drinking water. And I presented all that science to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who was the decision maker in this case. And they basically said, we're not scoping our risk assessment to take that into account. So it's outside the scope of what we're looking at. So no, we're not looking at your data. And so we lost every single appeal. So that's when I looked in my heart and decided that I was not just a scientist, I was also a mother who lived here with my community. So if you weren't going to listen to my data as a scientist, you're going to have to listen to my mother's body standing in the way. So we kicked off a 2.5-year civil disobedience campaign. We arrested 750 people, but it actually took us 2 years, not a summer like Summer of Heat just did. We filled the jails. I served two 15-day sentences, and we won. We so destroyed the brand of this gas storage company that they just left. So I just offer that as an object lesson in the path that I've walked as a scientist. I'm trying to figure out, do I just share my data with the decision makers? Do I share it also with the public? What if everybody says, so what? Am I willing to stand in the way? And so the answer for me was yes at Seneca Lake. And that once you kind of make that decision, you become brave. And so that experience allowed me to join Rose and my other fellow scientists this summer at Summer of Heat. So courage begets courage. And I think we need courage as much as we need data. Thanks.
Thanks, Sandra. You want to add anything, Rose? Anything upcoming for Scientist Rebellion?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say, rather than plugging any specific campaigns, that, if you want to take that next step into nonviolent grassroots campaigns, Scientist Rebellion is a group that has pods all over the world, and many different ways to contribute, both in person and remotely. So you can contribute as an activist or as a trainer or as an expert witness, or as a supporter. You know, if you're good with websites, we love that. There's a lot of different ways to help. If you know how to do proposal writing, there's a role for every skill, and if you don't have skills, we will teach them to you. You can go to scientistrebellion.org. There's a little blue button on the top right called Ways to Join. We have welcome meetings weekly in multiple languages. And we're proud supporters of campaigns like Summer of Heat, and we also run our own campaigns. And then if you have money but not time, you can make a donation to the Climate Emergency Fund, which is climateemergencyfund.org, a 501c3 that raises money and makes grants to nonviolent disruptive climate activists like the groups organizing Summer of Heat. And yeah, those are my 2 plugs. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Rose. And Michael, I don't know if you can hear or want to put anything into the room about upcoming actions, or either specific events and actions, or just what people ought to be doing in response to what we've heard here today.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me as well. You hearing me?
Yes, we
Hello?
still are. Yes, we still are.
Okay. Okay, all right. Thanks very much. Well, I think this approach, it takes a collaborative effort for us to be successful in anything that we do. And what we are doing here is one of those steps. And NYCC continues to work along with other entities and other organizations that are going forward in fighting against these institutions who are doing these harmful acts against our people, against the citizens of this country, against the world as a whole. And so what the NYCC is doing is working along with other entities. Upcoming events are there in the pipeline, as I was told in our last meeting that we had. And soon and very soon, persons are going to hear more about it. But it is not a single-handed effort. It takes all the organizations working together. It takes us lobbying with our councilmen and women who we would have put into office to work for us and to do the things that we ask them to do, many of which not doing. But hopefully we'll be able to get the attention of these councilmen and women, those who are in office, to really do that fight and fight for us, so that we will be able to protect. We still have some time to protect our environment for the future generation.
Thank you, Michael. And I'm going to chime in from the Union of Concerned Scientists. So, in the context for cities' financing of fossil fuel expansion, we have a massive and ongoing disinformation and greenwashing campaign by the fossil fuel industry. And a bicameral multi-year congressional investigation has brought to light new evidence of how BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Shell, since the adoption of the Paris Climate Agreement, continue to spread disinformation and really, continue to expand their fossil fuel exploration and extraction against what science shows us is necessary to limit the worst effects of climate change. And so, as important context for steering finance away from fossil fuels and toward the clean energy transition, we really need to continue to hold the fossil fuel companies accountable for their deception and greenwashing. And so one of the things that the Union of Concerned Scientists is doing is urging the Department of Justice to launch an investigation into the fossil fuel industry's coordinated effort to mislead the public and policymakers. And that's actually something that the DOJ did to hold the tobacco industry accountable. And so we'll paste a link into the chat there. And now we're going to get to some of the questions. And I think I want to ask Jenny actually for some examples of disrupting executives. And maybe with that as advice from all panelists to anyone who hasn't participated in a direct action campaign like the Summer of Heat. What should they be thinking about before they get started? So Jenny, first on executives.
Yeah, happy to give some more details. So we had a number of them this summer, and I'll talk about two in particular really briefly, which was specifically targeted at the CEO of Citibank, Jane Fraser. One of those first moments that we decided to escalate to her home. We had been protesting outside of Citibank, taking direct action outside of Citibank for weeks at this point. This was the end of July. And Jane Fraser lives like right around the corner from City HQ. At any point, she could be there, addressing these demands, offering to meet. It's no secret what's happening outside the doors of this company that she's in charge of. So we felt it was important to take it to her doorstep because climate change is at the doorstep of many people across the US and across the country. So in July and in the end of August, we had a large march starting at various locations, ending at the home of Jane Fraser, which is a multi-million-dollar apartment complex in Tribeca, and folks blocked the entrance. The first action was in honor of the many children who are displaced every day because of the climate crisis, and we built a memorial outside of her home and then blocked the entrance. At the end of August was to call out the corporate pinkwashing and greenwashing that Citi does, and Jane Fraser often hides behind her identity as a mother, as a woman CEO on Wall Street, as her ethos, for Citibank as a progressive bank. So it was to call out to say that, fossil fuels are not feminist because women and children across the world every day are disproportionately impacted by fossil fuels, and Citi is the one that is funding that industry. So we once again took to her apartment, marched around it, and then sat in the street right outside that entrance, and refused to move. And so folks were arrested as a result of that.
Great. Sandra, Rose, any advice for folks participating in direct action for the first time or contemplating it?
Well, I guess I'll just speak personally. We only each have one life. Why not live it heroically? That's kind of that's the sentence that occurred to me at one point. And I say that as somebody who's really introspective and pretty shy and would like nothing better than to look at data all day. So for me to be kind of breaking the rules and transgressive and breaking laws is kind of casting myself against type. So it can be stressful. But I decided, when I looked in my heart, that I was far more terrified of the world that my children are going to live in because of the climate crisis than I am the inside of a jail cell. So that kind of tipped things for me. That was my own self-discernment. And also, I had the chance to observe civil disobedience before I became a civil disobedient, and that was also transformational for me. And I didn't really intend to. I was actually asked to come and speak outside the courtroom during a trial of a climate activist, Tim DeChristopher, out in Utah. I was actually out in Utah doing field work at the time. So I was asked to just come and give a little speech outside the courtroom while he was being sentenced. And then he was hauled away in chains and sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. And people poured out of the courthouse and filled the streets almost spontaneously, I thought. But I think it was very planned and carefully done. And I was my first experience seeing this, and I just watched it, and it was terribly moved, especially when young people sat down on the tracks of the light rail system that runs through Salt Lake, and one woman held up a sign she's hardly older than my kids are now, right, in their early 20s, held up a sign that said climate justice now. And here came the train that had to stop. And on the sign of the train was a public health message. And I work in public health, so I see these all the time, right? From the American Cancer Society with the pink ribbon said, just get a mammogram. I thought, well, here it is, right? Just get a mammogram, detect terrible problems, versus climate justice now, prevent terrible problems. And they're actually standing off right here on the railroad tracks in front of me. And the bravery of this woman, just, and that she felt her life was so threatened, her future was so threatened that she would do that, changed me forever. So that when I went home and discovered what was happening with fracking in New York, what was happening with the salt cavern, those images, I began to see that I too could play that role and do that. And that for me, going to jail, especially even for, up to 2 weeks, was much less miserable than I thought, because I'm also a teenage cancer survivor. I was diagnosed early with cancer, so I've led a highly medicalized life. And being inside of a jail, for me, I actually bring a whole skill set with me that I didn't know I had, because I'm a really good patient. I can lie in an MRI machine totally unmoving for 30 minutes. I can have bone scans. I can have IV drips hooked up to me and walk down a hospital corridor holding my backless blue cotton gown shut with my other hand. So that means I can walk in ankle manacles and handcuffs. And I can lie in a jail cell with the lights on, because the hospital lights are on all night. I can, people can touch me in icky ways. They do that in the hospital too. So anyway, I know how to keep my head about me when I'm physically miserable, and that's because I've led this medicalized life. So I'm sure there are all kinds of things in your own life. Maybe you have family members who stood up against the Nazis, or you have something that's just incredibly courageous and heroic that's in your sort of ancestry, in your DNA, that you kind of bring with you in your life, that you suddenly realize can be drawn upon while you're joining with your fellow citizens against a line of police and riot gear that turns out not to be as terrifying as you might imagine.
Yeah.
We're getting close here. But Rose, please chime in, and then I've got one more question for Jenny before we do a closing round.
Okay, great. I'll try and be quick. I just wanted to add that I think it's good for us to take stock of how much responsibility we owe due to the amount of privilege we have. Like those of us who are joining from the US, which is probably a lot of us on this call, we live in a country with the largest excess historical emissions and the largest emissions per capita. And this gives us a unique opportunity to contribute to achieving the greatest cuts in emissions. And those of us who have safety nets, who can afford to lose our jobs and get new ones, or start our own institutes and apply for our own grants, those of us who can interact safely with the police or without fearing for our own lives, with that privilege comes responsibility. And I think a lot of us have much more privilege than we think that we do. And I should also say that activist communities create their own safety nets. We put each other up when we travel to actions. We crowdfund for each other. We cook for each other. We make our own banners. And so there is, the more you get to know us and the more you start to work with us, I think the more you'll start to feel safe with an activity that seems from far away quite frightening. That's all.
Excellent. Okay, so for Jenny, would a campaign to cancel city credit cards be effective?
So I'm assuming the question is coming from asking about, individuals. So the average retail customer, let's say I have a city credit card. There are versions of this happening in the country. And if you're curious about resources in terms of moving your money, if that's something you can do and you want to do as an individual, you can actually go on the stopthemoneypipeline.com website. We have resources there that advise you how to do that. But there's a strategic reason why the Summer of Heat chose not to focus on that as our campaign strategy. And that's because, the individual customer is not what's lining cities' pockets. We're not the ones that are pushing the levers of profit for Citibank. And just as climate change is not about individual actions, it's not about whether or not I'm using a plastic straw or a plastic water bottle. It's a systemic and infrastructural analysis that we have to bring to where power lies. That being said, there is a credit card component. There are very large companies that have partnerships with Citi for their credit cards. One example is Costco, and there is a campaign to have Costco cut. And through those retail customers at the larger scale is where Citi is making money. So in fact, as part of Summer of Heat, there was a day of action targeting Costco in particular, calling out Costco to stop their relationship with Citi. And you might have seen the hot dog costumes. That's why people were in hot dog costumes. And I actually saw someone in the chat talk about how they delivered a petition to a local Costco asking them to cut ties with Citi. And we did have a moment in the Summer of Heat campaign where we called upon people to take these petitions as a wave of action across many retailers that partner with Citibank to ask them to cut ties, to put Citi on notice that, you know, we're going to come for their profits in different ways. They don't cut their ties with the fossil fuel industry. So it's a great question. And many folks have it. And that's the answer why we didn't focus on the credit cards for individuals as a campaign.
Thanks so much, Jenny. Okay, so we are getting close to the top of the hour, but I'd love to hear from everyone. If you were to have a chance to meet face-to-face with Jane Fraser, the CEO of Citi, what would you say? And we'll start with Michael.
Yeah, can you repeat the question?
So sure will, Michael. The CEO of Citi is Jane Fraser. We heard a little bit from Jenny about actions. If you had a chance to meet one-on-one and face-to-face with her, what would you say?
I will ask the CEO about her family and what her family wants to do. How will she be looking? Sorry, how would she feel? How would you feel about your kids and your grandkids and your great grandkids? The impact that you are creating on their lives that is going to be negative in the long run. How are you going to feel about that? How can you sleep at night knowing the destruction and the devastation of your action and the impact on their life later on in life? Are you going to be happy the way that the earth is going to look, that the environment is going to be? And ask that CEO to speak to their board of directors and ask them so that she will also have that positive image and let them know that what they are doing is wrong and they need to stop doing what they're doing. I think if you take it to her family, the impact is going to have on her children, probably her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren. If you take it personally to her doorstep, I think they are going to look at it in a different way. If not, I'll say that they don't have any heart, as we say locally.
Wow, well, that I think would be a hard act to follow, and we're at the top of the hour. So I really want to extend so much thanks to our excellent panel today for a very powerful discussion. And I hope everyone leaves both inspired and empowered and equipped to take action. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kathy.